They say yield pays, but quality sells.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to the Comstock channel. I'm Marlin Bohling. So glad you could join us here today. I always like to remind everybody to make sure you like these videos, subscribe to the videos by clicking on that bell icon down below, and share these videos with others as well as we continue to grow our audience. And it's all thanks to your help as you help spread the word about what we cover on these episodes. And just a gentle reminder here, you might check out our premium services. You might be interested in the terrific information that we publish every morning as a detailed newsletter about the markets and what is impacting life in the ag industry. Check that out because you can get a month of that as a trial for just $1. Gosh, you can't beat that. Well, today my very special guest is Ken Lege. He is a cotton specialist with Texas A&M University's AgriLife Extension Service. Ken happens to be based in Lubbock, Texas, and everybody that I have talked to over the years, Ken states that Lubbock, Texas is basically about ground zero for cotton production in the U.S. Doesn't get much better than where you are right there. So from your perspective, give me an idea of how the crop looks this year.
Well, you're right. This is the largest cotton patch in the world, and certainly the United States. Within 100 miles of Lubbock, has about 40% of the U.S. acres. So it's continuous cotton here, and it's a great place to be if you're a cotton guy like I am. So we started the year out actually fairly well. It was a dry winter, but that's not unusual for the high plains. We typically have dry winters. We received planting rains, very timely planting rains, and got the crop in actually on time, which hadn't happened in a while. And keep in mind, this is following 2022 and 23 that had historic, particularly 23, had historic abandonment rates from storms, from drought, you name it, we had it. So we had a lot of promise coming into 2024, especially when we were able to plant the crop and generally get good stand establishment. And then we continued in general to get fairly frequent rainfall, not every location, of course, but in general, the High Plains region continued to get fairly good rainfall. We actually had fairly milder conditions in July with some frequent rainfall till about August 5th or 6th. And then reality check came back, and the rain stopped as a high pressure system parked itself right on top of us. And all that heat that those high pressure systems bring has begun to bear down on us since that time. So we've had more 100-degree days than we care to even discuss, and of course that's driven evapotranspiration rates really high, 3,500 to 4/10 of an inch a day out of the soil and through the plant systems. So we've depleted the soil moisture. And in some cases, crops that we thought we had and kind of built some expectations for are not going to deliver those expectations. That said, we still have some decent cotton in the region. In particular, if we look at the upper panhandle of Texas into the Oklahoma panhandle that had such a tough go of it in 2023. Normally, we would expect about 500,000 acres in that area, and last year there was less than 100,000 acres that even survived, and even those that survived just did not produce what they expected. This year, that 450,000 to 500,000 acres of cotton is back and is actually doing quite well. And of course, they have a little bit more water. They typically run cotton in half circles with corn. Of course, the beauty of that is when corn peak demand is earlier than that of cotton, so they can stretch their wells out over the season and make some pretty darn good yields. And that cotton crop is actually looking very good. So there's lots of potential there, and that's good news for the industry and good news for the infrastructure, because there are quite a few large ginning operations in that part of the world that need some volume to go through those plants. So we're glad to see that crop back.
How widespread is irrigation in your part of the country there?
So if we take about an hour and a half north and south of Lubbock, we're about 80% dry land. And the 20% that is irrigated About half of that we always call limited irrigation or light irrigation, meaning they have just enough to, a gallon and a half to 2.5 gallons per minute per acre. So that's supplemental, and always the big decision there is when do you use it? Do you use it to establish stand? Do you use it during bloom? Are always tough decisions on those acres. And then there's there's a little bit more irrigated acres that have higher capacity, but those are getting more and more infrequent and lower in volume. But they still do exist where we have 5-6 gallons per minute per acre that can produce one heck of a good cotton crop. So, if we take it from, say, Tula, Texas down to Lubbock, so that's a pretty good swath. That's probably more like a 40% irrigated, 60% dry land scenario. They have a little bit more water than south of Lubbock. That crop got planted on time and is actually in pretty decent shape. There's actually some dry land acres in that swath that are actually looking pretty good, particularly if you have from Swisher County, Hale County on to the east to Floyd and Crosby County. They actually got some pretty good rainfall up and through the early August period, and that rainfall has lasted, and we're going to make a decent dry land crop by and large. The really tough area is from Lubbock southward, and if you take that swath, that's like about 90% dry land on some lighter textured soils, so we don't have quite the water holding capacity in those lighter textured soils as we do in those heavier textured soils above Lubbock. That crop is generally later planted, and in this scenario of this year, earlier planted crops tended to fare better because we were blooming and setting bolls in that milder July. Of course, I just described the awful August that we've had with triple-digit temperatures, and more importantly, elevated nighttime lows as well. So it's not unusual to find something in the upper 70s, lower 80s at nighttime, which for us is quite warm. It has a detrimental effect on fruit load. That southern crop that I just described has really taken it on the chin. So there's a lot of dry land that's not going to make. So there will be abandonment there, particularly. But there are a few pockets that did receive some time to rainfall that's going to make. But there's lots of limited irrigation. So lots of that light irrigation south of Lubbock that's hanging on is going to make bale and a half realistic yields. But at least they're going to make a crop. Like I say, in 22 and 23, that wasn't the case. This massive abandonment and a lot of the GNE infrastructure was hurt as a result.
When you have a late season heat regime like we're seeing this year, how does that manifest itself in the quality of the cotton fiber?
Well, certainly from a yield perspective, it is detrimental from keeping those fruit on the plant because the cotton plant responds to heat and drought during this time of year by shedding those young squares and young bolls. Because cotton is a perennial shrub. So in the mind of a cotton plant, if a cotton plant had a mind, it would think, well, I don't have a chance to make fruit this year, so I'll just grow some stalk and produce seed next year for continuation of the species. So it naturally sheds things. So we've seen some young square and boll abortion, and we see those in the row middles. From a fiber quality perspective, length of the fiber is set in the first 21 days after bloom, and then coarseness or fineness expressed in what we measure as micronair is set from like week 3 to week 6. Well, that later planted crop, particularly the stuff that's planted south of Lubbock, is going to take it on the chin in both periods of time. So length is going to be adversely affected because we had all that heat and drought. And then what fruit did set is not going to thicken, not going to have micronair development because there's just not enough resources in that plant in that scenario. Now we could get some rain in early September, hopefully. If that happens, maybe that does save a little bit of that crop. But with every day when I check the 2-week forecast, that's looking unlikely at this point.
Well, earlier in the year, you and I talked, and there was so much optimism about the cotton production and the ability to make income on cotton this year. Gosh, last spring we had it like $1.05 on the nearby prices, and now here we are. And gosh, the cotton here recently has been under 70 cents, been down in the 60s on the new crop contracts there. What the heck happened to cause all the wheels to fall off on the cotton market here this summer?
Well, 20, 30 years ago, what happened in the high plains drove a lot of the price because there was a lot of domestic consumption. So all the mills were in the United States. Only 20% of the crop was being exported. And now, 20, 30 years later, after NAFTA, we're completely opposite. So only about 20% is consumed domestically, and 80% is exported primarily to Asia, various parts of Asia. So we're a global commodity now. And now that Brazil has gone into cotton over the last 15 or so years, a lot of what Brazil and Australia do in their alternate seasons drives the cotton price. So from every report I've heard, the Brazilian crop and the Australian crop is actually quite good. And that, I think that's partly depressing the price of cotton. But now it's so complex that even those that study this for a living, some cotton economists and even the merchants are scratching their head trying to guess what the price is going to do. And the simple fact is now, even though we're a large cotton patch that produces quite a bit of cotton annually, we're not the driver in the high plains that we once were in terms of the commodity price. Yes, we have an effect, but there's so many more effects globally that it's difficult to even assess what's driving that price down. And of course, growers would love to know that pattern so they can plan accordingly. But I'm afraid that the experts that study this for a living are just as baffled as the laymen who look at the markets.
I was looking back on a December cotton chart here, and it looks like from about mid-February out for about a month or month and a half, producers did have a chance to maybe lock in 85 cents on the new crop cotton on the board. Any idea how many guys actually did take advantage of it this year? Do you think it was just the usual percentage, or do you think they were more aggressive this year?
Well, in places that are more rain fed and can be assured that they're going to make a crop, Mid-South, Southeast portions of the Cotton Belt in the United States, I suspect there was probably a higher percentage, taking advantage of that tool. Here in the high plains where it's so risky, we never know if a hailstorm is going to take us out. And then if we do have a stand, will we make a crop? Because, droughts are a common part of our production system. So growers in the high and rolling plains that are dependent on rainfall in a semi-arid environment have found that it's very risky for them to take advantage of those future markets because they don't know if they're going to have cotton to deliver. And especially coming off of 2 tough years, I think, participation in those tools from the high and rolling plains was probably at a very low level because they just come off of 2 very tough years. And it would take a lot of study to figure out what's our risk going into 24 after coming off of really tough years where they couldn't, had they taken advantage of that, they would not have been able to deliver those bales.
As we record this, of course, now we're looking at a Canadian rail strike. And that brings to mind, Ken, there is a threat of a longshoreman strike in the eastern and Gulf coasts of the U.S. Once we get into September. Now, it's a ways down the road yet, but and I don't know how much of a threat that really will turn out to be. But if that would come to pass, how much would that impact cotton values coming out of the U.S.?
I think it would have a significant effect. And certainly as an agronomist, that's way beyond my wheelhouse. But, I look at the markets probably as closely as you do. And knowing that 80% of our fiber is exported, that can't help but have a significant effect on the price. And then if you can lock in a price and get a buyer, can those bale contracts actually be delivered on time to the consumer in Asia? So that is the mill in Asia. So that becomes a question. And will then the mills in Asia go to another geography that may not be having those issues is the concern. So that's certainly on the radar of every cotton grower in the United States, is looking at both of those scenarios, thinking, okay, I may do a good job and produce a great crop, may can get a buyer, but can my merchant get it delivered to the mill is going to be risky. It's very worrisome for the whole infrastructure. Can we deliver that product to the end user?
Now, from what I understand, I believe it's more centered on maybe container handling. When I think of grain shipping overseas, you're talking about a bulk ship. You open the hatches and you just pour it all in and off they go. So how do they transport cotton? Is that done in containers or bulk ship?
Typically in Sealand containers. Yeah, that's typically how they're shipped.
So it would be more susceptible then.
Absolutely. And in West Texas, most of our cotton that's exported, which is the grand majority, probably above that 80%, it primarily go through ports in Texas. So Houston, Corpus, primarily. So those are the export shipping points that are a great concern. There's a little bit that goes out west, goes on rail and then goes to the California ports, but most of it goes through Texas ports.
When you drive around and look at cotton fields, I'm sure you see some other crops in your area there as well. What kind of crops do they grow and what do they look like now?
Well, there actually is more than normal of grain sorghum going to grain, particularly Plainview southward. A little bit more grain sorghum. You get south and west of Lubbock, there's a fairly good peanut market, and the contracts, from what I understand, were fairly attractive. So those peanut crops are growing, and that, from what I know about peanuts, which is very little, but those who know have told me that they have a good crop this year. So that's encouraging for those guys. And of course, we will want them to make money on every crop to sustain their operation. Now you go a little bit further north, certainly above Amarillo. So there's significant dairy industry in the upper Panhandle, and of course, anytime you have dairy, we need some cow feed. So a lot of that corn up there is silage corn, and they are moving into some silage sorghums as well. As the water availability decreases, those sorghum hybrids that do well under silage conditions can take advantage of those lighter water scenarios that they're beginning to face.
I have heard that hay production, and when I say hay, in this case, I'm thinking mainly alfalfa, but I've heard that's on the rebound this year after being drought impacted for what, 4 years straight, something like that.
Yeah, there's a little bit of alfalfa here. You really have to get to almost the Oklahoma Panhandle before you see significant alfalfa fields. But you'll see a few alfalfa fields here in the high plains. You see more as you go westward into eastern New Mexico. Again, as you get closer to some of those dairy operations. But yeah, here around Lubbock, you'd have to search far and wide for an alfalfa field.
All right, so give me an idea. What are you looking at for harvest time this year on your cotton crop there?
So, some of the early planted crops that were planted in early May, we could see some harvest aid being applied as early as late September, mid-October, and see some strippers in the field by mid-October, particularly on some light water pivots that hasten maturity. So we could start harvesting here mid-October, and that usually peaks around the mid-November mark. And a lot of growers around here love to have their harvest done by Thanksgiving. Sometimes that's successful, sometimes not. So it typically does go into early December. If we have a really good crop, or if we have inclement weather during harvest, which we hope does not happen, sometimes that does extend beyond Christmas and New Year's, and sometimes we're still stripping cotton in early January. Now, if it's because we have such a large crop, that'd be great. But if it's because inclement weather, we'd rather not have that scenario.
Well, Texas is such a big state. I would imagine that probably in the far south, they're already harvesting at this point, aren't they?
Yes, yeah, the lower Rio Grande Valley is nearly complete. Harvest is on the last half in the coastal bend area around Corpus Christi and just beginning in the upper coast as you get north of Victoria. Here in about another month or so, it will be in the Brazos Bottoms around College Station and on upward. So yeah, that crop faced a totally different scenario than what we faced here on the high plains. They had tremendous rainfall early, and at times had tough times surviving the floods. And of course, then they had a tropical system move through, which luckily didn't do a lot of damage. Twisted up some plants, but the word from down south is it didn't do quite the damage that they were afraid of. So they're able to pick those, and those bales are coming out of the gin as we speak down there. So glad to see those folks survive that tropical system. We were hoping that we'd get some rain off of that tropical system in the high plains, and it simply didn't come to fruition.
So is cotton kind of like corn, where once they start gathering cotton in, picking cotton or harvesting cotton, does that keep a lid on the market then due to harvest pressure, or does that not work the same way?
I don't know that it has a lot of bearing on the cotton price. Um, and sometimes it depends on what the quality may be of that crop. And of course, as different timing from south to north dictates, if you have a significant swath of the country that has poor quality, sometimes that shifts what the market's looking for. As they say, yield pays, but quality sells. So you can make some yield, but getting a contract on that fiber may be a different story. So the market's always looking for high quality, of course, long, strong, fine, and mature. And then it's not an easy thing to produce, unfortunately, in a lot of parts of the country. So it's always a guessing game on what that's going to do. But from talking to our fellow economists, I don't know that there's they continue to scratch their heads, and it makes me feel better as an agronomist that I don't understand the market any more than an expert does.
That's awesome. All right. Well, thank you for taking time and getting us updated on what's going on with the crop this year and maybe with the markets too. It does bear watching, that's for sure. But anyway, we're not that far away from getting into full swing cotton harvest. We're within a couple of months now. So keep an eye on developments there. And of course, everything could change with the approach of any tropical systems and that sort of thing. Ken, great to talk with you again. Thank you very much. Ken Lege is with Texas A&M University's AgriLife Extension Service. That'll do it for this episode. We thank you for joining us. For producer Brianne Hendrickson, I'm Marlin Bohling. We'll catch you next time on the Comstock channel. Thanks for joining us on our Comstock YouTube channel. Don't forget you can also find us on Facebook and TikTok as well. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and or options is substantial, and each investor and or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.